This is Federal Grants Explained with your host, Patrice Davis. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, you've likely heard of the massive Feeding Our Future fraud that happened in Minnesota. The first thing to point out is that this has been widely reported since January 2022. So while it's been highly politicized, I'm going to stay above the political fray and dig a little into the grants themselves, the grant programs, and how the programs were supposed to be structured, and then launch into why I chose this topic. And really, that's to highlight something that is a challenge for many federal grantees: subrecipient management and monitoring. Before we get started, welcome back to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a video series and now a podcast I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants. My name is Patrice Davis. I'm the founder and CEO of GrantWin Consulting, formerly GrantsWorks. We are a federal grant consulting and training firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. While most of our episodes have been focused on what's happening at the federal agency level, I actually specialize in federal grant compliance. I speak, train, and write about federal grant compliance, best practices, about when things go wrong, and I try to connect the dots between federal grant funding and the positive impact federal grants can have on people and communities. I'm one of about 300 certified grant management specialists in the country. And something that's very relevant to this specific episode, I led a team responsible for carrying out subrecipient monitoring activities for over 1,400 Department of Justice subrecipients. My firm has developed subrecipient monitoring policies and procedures for multiple clients. And I actually conducted monitoring visits of state agency recipients of federal grants. And guess what was a common finding? Inadequate subrecipient monitoring and related requirements. So a lot of federal grant compliance rests on being able to support the cost charged to a federal grant. So today I'm giving away the supporting documentation and cost allowability primer for federal grantees. Just add the word primer in the comments below and our team will get one to you right away. Now back to why we're here. I'll start with the summary of the infamous Feeding Our Future conundrum. So first, Feeding Our Future is the name of a nonprofit that was based in Minnesota. The organization was led by the person identified as the mastermind of all of the fraudulent activities, and her name is Aimee Bock. Feeding Our Future was a sponsor for the Summer Food Service Program and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. They are both grant programs awarded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Here are two quick videos about the SFSP and the CACFP. Hi there. So I wanted to quickly provide you with some more information about the Child and Adult Care Food Program that I am speaking about briefly to make a larger point about subrecipient management and monitoring. So I'm looking at a page on sam.gov and the assistance listing is 10.558, and that is the assistance listing that is matched with the Child and Adult Care Food Program. There's some important things here I wanted to point out, that number one, there are related federal assistance, but this specific one is the one I'm looking at. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, the Child and Adult Care Food Program is administered and awarded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Food and Nutrition Service, or FNS. And it is basically a program that assists states through grants and aid to initiate and maintain nonprofit food service programs for children and elderly or impaired adults enrolled in non-residential daycare facilities, children attending after-school care programs in low-income areas, and children residing in emergency shelters. So, again, the USDA operates that program in partnership with state administrative agencies. And that's how the state is able to, that's why the state is able to get the funding. I do also want to point out more important information. Number one, it is awarded as a grant. So doing another overview, but this time of the Summer Food Service Program for children. Just as with the Child and Adult Care Food Program, CACFP, this program is administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as you can see here. Again, also by the Food and Nutrition Service Office, the Office of Food and Nutrition Service, or the division. The assistance listing number is 10.559. Just as with the CACFP program, this is awarded to state agencies, and those state agencies then subaward the funds to sponsors that are on the ground. So as you can see here before, it is awarded as a grant. And those grant, you do have to comply with 2 CFR 200, all sections, but they do point out subpart E here, cost principles. The eligible award applicant types are, again, department or agency of a U.S. territorial government, department or agency of a U.S. state government. And so the way that this works is the state, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, applies for and signs the agreement to receive federal funds for disbursement. The state agency enters into agreement with each sponsor that has been approved for participation, and then the agreement is permanent and may be amended as necessary. And that's very interesting to ensure compliance with all federal requirements. Sponsors must agree to operate a nonprofit food service that is available to all eligible children, regardless of race, sex, color, national origin, age, or disability. Quick side note, I used to serve as a compliance oversight lead for large organizations, SFSP and CACFP programs. So I know quite a bit about the programs, the massive amount of documentation required to substantiate attendance, inventory levels, site eligibility, and the details required to substantiate those food costs. As a sponsor, Feeding Our Future was responsible for the following, and this is really important, so please listen to the list. Feeding Our Future was responsible for attending state agency training sessions, locating and recruiting eligible sites, hiring, training, and supervising staff and volunteers, arranging for meals to be prepared or delivered, monitoring the sites, preparing claims for reimbursement, and ensuring the food project and sites are sustainable through partnerships and fundraising and volunteer recruitment. According to multiple online sources, the Feeding Our Future fraud activities and massive network was made possible because Aimee Bock, some Feeding Our Future staff, and other co-conspirators did the following. They recruited individuals and entities to open feeding sites throughout the state, which were then created and then operated by Aimee Bock. They allowed co-conspirator Saeed and others to claim to serve meals to thousands of children a day within just days or weeks of those entities being formed. They submitted false documentation such as fraudulent meal counts and fake attendance rosters to list the names and ages of children. So basically the names and ages of many of the children, if not most of the children on those lists, were also falsified. They submitted fraudulent claims to the Minnesota Department of Education and then distributed the reimbursements to the co-conspirators involved. They created dozens of shell companies. And Feeding Our Future also received more than $18 million in, quote, administrative fees when the organization's employees solicited and received bribes and kickbacks, many of which were paid in cash or disguised as consulting fees paid to shell companies created by the organization's employees. They enabled site operators to commit fraud, and they claimed to have served 91 million meals in the state of Minnesota. So all in all, Feeding Our Future allegedly opened more than 250 meal sites throughout the state and went from receiving and dispersing approximately $3.4 million in federal funds in 2019, that's before the pandemic, to nearly $200 million in 2021, and then a grand total of over $240 million in fraudulent funds. Aimee Bock, again, the reported mastermind of this massive fraud network, was convicted in March 2025 on 4 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bribery, and federal programs bribery. She had to forfeit more than $5 million, clothes, electronics, and a Porsche. Here is a video that reveals how she allegedly treated and spoke as if she was running a mob-like operation. So I'll let that video run now. So, since we are featuring just a few of the people that were involved in the Feeding Our Future scandal, I wanted to shine a light a bit on Aimee Bock and just a couple of text messages that apparently she's reported to have sent when some of the things that were happening were being questioned. So, this is Aimee Bock. She is considered the quote mastermind of the Feeding Our Future fraudulent operation. So apparently there were instances when she pushed back as food site operators, state officials, and members of the public questioned Feeding Our Future's legitimacy. And then apparently, according to text messages, she said, I'm going to show them how real bosses play. And that's in a 2021 text message to her alleged co-conspirator. And that she compared her nonprofit to the mob and referenced loading the gun in case in reaction to criticism from a state official. So I just wanted to shed some light on, first of all, who the mastermind is and, get some more insight into some of the things that were reportedly happening behind the scenes. I also wanted to point this out because Ms. Bock apparently is claiming that she's innocent and she actually puts the blame on state officials who didn't do the monitoring they were supposed to do. And without all the details, in terms of what they monitored, I don't know, but I do know that the Minnesota Department of Education is required to actually monitor its subrecipients. And so, I would love to learn a little bit more about what the state did or did not do. Also want to point out that Sahan Journal, great publication. I've been able to learn a lot more. A lot of these other articles about this doesn't really provide some of the details that I want. So in addition to finding out information on, some of the government websites that I'm familiar with, I've been really able to rely on Sahan Journal and the amazing journalistic work that they do. So hats off to them. All right. According to media reports, she has not yet been sentenced, but could be sentenced for up to 30 years. She maintains her innocence, but here's the thing. She, quote, signed off on every single fraudulent claim that was submitted to the state of Minnesota. It's important to know that before some of this was revealed, Bock sued and won a case against the state of Minnesota Department of Education in November 2020 because they delayed processing of the organization's grant applications. She sued because she claimed the state was failing to approve certain applicants and that the state's failure to approve was racially motivated and that the applicants were also denied because of their national origin, color, and religion. Interestingly, she won the case and the department was ordered to resume processing of the organization's site applications. She also believes she's a scapegoat for the state's alleged failure to properly monitor participating food vendors in the program. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, her main co-conspirator, Salim Saeed, has been convicted of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit federal programs bribery itself, and conspiracy to commit money laundering and money laundering itself. To date, the government has recovered more than $50 million from 60 bank accounts, 45 pieces of property and numerous vehicles, and again, other items such as electronics and high-end clothing. So far, over 70 people have been charged, with 5 individuals convicted by a jury. Some others have pled guilty. As I mentioned earlier, Feeding Our Future was a sponsor for the Summer Food Service Program and the Child and Adult Care Program. Both are administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So how this works is that the USDA awards the funds to states, and then the state subawards the funds to other entities such as organizations like Feeding Our Future, and that organization or those organizations function as a sponsor. It's important to note here that the USDA waived some standard requirements for participation in these programs. For example, it allowed for-profit restaurants to participate in the program and allowed for off-site food distribution outside of educational programs. They also waived the requirement for on-site monitoring of food service sites, and this is very, very important. I also want to point out that USDA and all other federal awarding agencies actually were were instructed to waive certain federal grant requirements based on memos released by the Office of Management and Budget in March 2020. They realized that many organizations' programs couldn't continue because of the pandemic, and of course, there had to be limited or no interaction to avoid the spread of COVID-19. And so there were memos sent by the Office of Management and Budget, and they were basically instructing federal agencies to waive certain requirements. So USDA was basically doing what, it felt was the right thing to do. So I do want to just make sure that they didn't, waive those requirements just because. They waived them because of what was happening at the time and because they were directed to do so by the Office of Management and Budget. Here is a quick video featuring USDA Food and Nutrition Service policies about some of the waived requirements. Okay, so as I said, another really important part of this puzzle is that there were several program requirements that were waived during the pandemic. So I do want to point out here that in response, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, signed into law on March 18, 2020, gave the Food and Nutrition Service authority to issue nationwide waivers of CN program requirements. The waivers authorize the use of the Seamless Summer Option and Summer Food Service Program to serve all meals for free during non-summer months. So that's definitely something that they allowed new meal service methods that prioritize access and safety. So that's important. They prioritize access and safety and streamlined administrative requirements. So this is really important, again, as it ties to some of the other things that we're finding out that happened during the Feeding Our Future issue. Again, I realize a lot of the content that I'm doing now is really focused on this particular issue, but what I'm trying to do is connect the dots between what the requirements typically are and where there were changes to the requirements because we were, all of this was kind of happening or starting during the pandemic, and where some gaps existed. For the Summer Food Service Program, or the SFSP, participating sites receive reimbursement for meals distributed to low-income children by food sites like schools, nonprofits, restaurants, and more. Each food site must have a sponsor organization, and the food sites report on how many meals they serve to the sponsor organization, which then submits the reports to the government for reimbursement. So part of the reason I decided to dive into this topic is because we have quite a bit of experience in subrecipient monitoring, and that's policies and procedures, developing a monitoring plan, complying with regulatory requirements, cost allowability, reporting requirements, and much more. And we're actually hosting an upcoming cohort about this very topic. Here's a quick video about the upcoming cohort. Hi again, it is Patrice Davis, CEO of GrantWin, formerly GrantsWorks, and I wanted to tell you about something that we're really excited about. So one of the things that we did this year is we relaunched with a new name. We are now GrantWin Consulting, and there's a whole bunch of really good reasons for us doing that. And we also decided that we were going to focus on really honing in on those challenge areas for a number of federal grantees. One of them is subrecipient monitoring and, of course, monitoring grant-funded contracts and some of the differences and the similarities in how that looks for organizations. So we are doing this through cohort-based training programs. The very first cohort, Federal Grant Risk Assessment Best Practices, Evaluating and Monitoring Your Subrecipients and Grant-Funded Contracts, that starts in, just a little bit over a week. And so this is just a one-pager providing some information about the course itself and the continuing education credits that you get. You will receive National Association of State Boards of Accountancy continuing education units to participate in this particular cohort and in any of the other 6 cohorts that we have planned in 2026, the delivery method, the cohort meeting days and times, who should participate, some of the outcomes, and of course some of the learning objectives. And then you get to learn a little bit more about what's included, how to register, and of course the registration link is also in this video description below. So subrecipient monitoring, something that I know quite a bit about. I used to be responsible, my team and I, for monitoring over 1,400 subrecipients each year for a national organization. So monitoring them, ensuring compliance, providing the training, creating all of the resources that are needed to make sure that subrecipients are at least aware of what their responsibilities are, and carrying out site visits and all of those things. I have quite a bit of experience with that, so I will be the first facilitator of our cohort-based programs. And so I'm looking forward to you learning more about this cohort and potentially joining us. So again, information in the video description below. Okay, so what is a pass-through entity? In the Feeding Our Future situation, the Minnesota Department of Education was the pass-through entity. It passed through federal grant funds to Feeding Our Future. As a pass-through entity, the state is supposed to conduct risk assessments, ensure compliant subawards are distributed to their subrecipients, enter subaward data into sam.gov. It used to have to be entered into something called fsrs.gov. They need to monitor their subawards, conduct site visits or other monitoring activities, and more requirements related to allowable costs, indirect cost rates, etc., etc. Compliance requirements of a federal grant flow down from a federal agency to the pass-through entity and then to each subrecipient. So this is really important to understand. Again, compliance requirements of a federal grant flow down from federal agencies to pass-through entities and then to the subrecipients. For grant-funded contracts, however, there are requirements on what should be in their actual contracts. So I wanted to briefly touch on something that's very important in the world of federal grants, and that is something called subrecipient versus contractor determination. And that is something that we're not going to get into this video, but I did want to make sure that we touched on that a little bit. Here's a video about what the state agency staff knew. So once again, thanks to the good folks at Sahan Journal for fantastic reporting. They just are really helping me uncover and piece together what happened here. Let me first say that again, because I'm staying out of the politics, I am not necessarily concerned with what Tim Walz knew or did not know. What I am really interested in finding out, which I was able to learn a little bit more in this particular article without having access to the actual award documents. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about what the state did once it learned of what it believed to be fraudulent behavior. I'm going to go ahead now and look at what has been reported. So according to this article in the Sahan Journal, the Minnesota Department of Education did alert the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Feeding Our Future about suspicious activity in the summer of 2020, a few months after the alleged fraud actually began. And then during the first trial, the MDEs, that's the Minnesota Department of Education, their Director of Nutrition Program Services, testified that the USDA helped them, being the state agency, determine that Feeding Our Future and other nonprofits in the food aid program were seriously deficient. So I do also want to point out in a little bit here that I thought was really interesting, because that's what I want to get, that's part of the reason why I wanted to focus on this particular story. And that is, what investigations had been conducted into possible state culpability in the Feeding Our Future fraud. And so according to this article, the Minnesota State Senate Education Committee conducted hearings into the matter in 2022. They questioned several MDE employees, including then Commissioner Mueller. So I'm not going to go into who was in power at the time, but one of the things that I thought that was really interesting is that, state Senate Republicans led by former state Senator Roger Chamberlain, who chaired the Education Committee at the time, grilled the former Minnesota Department of Education Commissioner and other MDE employees. And to this day, and this is something I find really interesting, to this day, Senator Roger Chamberlain argues that MDE would have caught and prevented the fraud much earlier if staff had visited food sites in person to determine if they were serving the amount of food they reported. That's really important because that is actually something that is typically required of pass-through entities. So the state was serving as a pass-through entity and it passed through federal funding to Feeding Our Future as the sponsor. And one of the things, though, that is extremely important is that the federal government had waived site visits during the pandemic to avoid spreading COVID. So That's a really important detail. And that's just something, because immediately once I heard about the Feeding Our Future case, I immediately first wondered, okay, is it a grant? And if it's a grant, who was the pass-through? What organization was the pass-through entity? How were the funds actually awarded to Feeding Our Future? What were the monitoring activities that were conducted by the pass-through entity of the subrecipients, such as Feeding Our Future? So that's a very important detail. And again, part of the reason why I'm recording this particular episode. All right. So what is a subrecipient? According to federal grant regulations, a subrecipient is defined as an entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity to carry out part of a federal program. They make programmatic decisions, and interestingly, they can concurrently receive awards as a subawardee under one grant and as a grant-funded contractor under another grant. Subrecipients are required to adhere to applicable federal program requirements and to relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. So in the case of Feeding Our Future was a subrecipient of funding from the Minnesota Department of Education. Okay, then, well, what is subrecipient monitoring? So I covered some of this above, but a pass-through entity, again, is required to monitor its subrecipients. And what do I mean by monitoring? Again, they need to conduct a risk assessment, ensure applicable terms flow down, review programmatic and financial reports, conduct monitoring activities, review audits, and more. Pass-through entities are supposed to create subrecipient monitoring policies and procedures that factors in risk-based oversight. All right. And that's something that won't happen if the subrecipient is being called a contractor and if the subrecipient receives a document called a contract. One of the things I shared with one of our clients the other day is that whenever we train, organizations about pass-through entity requirements, we almost always recommend that they call the contracts to their vendors a contract, and then call their subawards to their subrecipients a subaward, just to differentiate between the two. I mean, the name matters significantly, especially since, unfortunately, the document that the subrecipient receives is called a contract. My recommendation for, pass-through entities, especially state and local government agencies, create another version of your existing contract for services and products and call it a subaward, change the name, and, of course, just use that as the subaward template going forward. There are a lot of other things that need to be factored into that subaward template, but if you create two different documents and use them accordingly, that will help eliminate a lot of confusion for the pass-through entity and certainly for the subrecipients. We have a client right now that's dealing with some very significant I would say confusion because of the type of agreement they received and just a lot of confusion around exactly what their role was. And because their role will determine some other outcomes, it's really, really important that pass-through entities get that right and that subrecipients are very clear about exactly what their roles are and exactly what their responsibilities are. So I'm going to focus a bit on findings related to insufficient monitoring. Ineffective subrecipient monitoring is a frequent single audit finding. I reviewed a few details of certain states' single audit findings, and the ones related to subrecipient monitoring were primarily around FFATA, which is the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, unsupported subrecipient reimbursements, and not following up on subrecipients' corrective actions. When I conducted monitoring visits of state agencies as a subcontractor, as a federal subcontractor, many of the findings were, one, not having a monitoring plan, not using proper subawards, not conducting risk assessments, and not ensuring the subaward was used for its intended purpose, right? So as a reminder, Grant Win will be hosting a 4-week cohort-based training session on subrecipient monitoring. Information about the program and details about how you can register are below. So that's the end of this episode of Federal Grants Explained. If you want to learn more, resources I used to create this episode can be found in the description below. Again, quite a bit of federal grant compliance rests on being able to support the costs charged to a federal grant. So today I'm giving away the supporting documentation and cost allowability primer for federal grantees. Again, just add the word primer in the comments below and our team will get one to you right away. If there's an important detail I didn't cover or even something I misreported or misrepresented, you can also drop that in the comments. I am open to and I do read your comments and feedback. Grant Win is a grant consulting and training firm based in Atlanta, Georgia that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and other government grants, as well as grants from foundations and corporations. We train your teams to manage its grants, help you identify compliance gaps, monitor and modify award budgets, set up financial management systems, develop required written policies and procedures, and become single audit ready. You can learn more about me and Grant Win in the details below. Also, check out the links in the description below to learn about Grants Works Academy, which will change to Grant Win Academy very soon, including the Federal Grant IQ training series and the Grant Win Grant Collective, which is a new membership that we offer for grant professionals all around the country and, of course, around the world. By the way, the training is accredited for continuing education units by the National Association for the State Boards of Accountancy, Certified Fundraising Executive, and Grant Professional Certifications Institute. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching or listening to Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.